When I first watched the trailer for Cruella, I assumed that this film was going to be a Cruella de Vil origin story. A complicated victim of circumstances, a despised genius, or how many critics were describing it, Disney's own Joker film. Basically another Maleficent. Cruella will be presented as a misunderstood villain seeking a justified revenge. The film's gonna say, see? She's not that bad, you guys. A film to say there's nobody you can't learn to love once you've heard their story. A film where we're all meant to feel bad for the puppy murderer because she had it bad too, you guys. Nobody thought to stop and listen to the dog snatcher's backstory, did they? Yeah, she might have killed a few puppies or tried to or whatever, but let's get to know her, like, who is Cruella? And I don't think I'm alone in that assumption. But actually, this film isn't Cruella's origin story. It's more like it's a totally different character and story. It uses elements of 101 Dalmatians, but it plays more like a fan fiction or like a new Cruella cinematic universe. Cruella, the 2021 feature, is not Cruella's origin. So first of all, logistically, Cruella just couldn't be a prequel to 101, even if we push aside for a moment that they're just completely different characters. Timeline-wise, the films literally don't line up. Cruella, the feature, is set in 1970s London, amidst the emergence of the new punk rock scene, which is a really cool backdrop, while 101 Dalmatians is set in the time period it was made, late 50s to early 60s. But I was pretty convinced that this was going to be 101's Cruella's origin story, and I don't think you can blame me here for making this assumption, because if you haven't noticed, live-action Disney remakes can go one or two ways. First, you've got your Lion Kings and your Beauty and the Beasts, the shot-by-shot regurgitation of the original. The ones that, in my opinion, tend to suck the magic out of the original animated film in favour of a kind of duller duplication that has very little personality of its own. It doesn't really put much to the table or add a lot other than, oh, we used cameras this time. Except when it's the Lion King and it's not live action, it's all CGI. But anyway, that's a rant for a different day. And then you've got your Maleficents, okay? So the first one's the just sort of duplication. And the second one is the more adaptive versions of the classic Disney that sort of leans more into the sympathetic origin of the original. How did these villains become villains? Anyway, get yourself a wee cup of tea, get cozy, and let's compare the two Cruellas. So let's look at some of the source material here. 101 Dalmatians. So it's been 60 years since Disney released 101 Dalmatians, and we know a little bit more about Disney as a brand. And I think it's fun to note here too, real quick, that all other Disney feature films prior to 101 Dalmatians, except maybe Dumbo, were either period pieces or set in some sort of otherworldly fantasy setting with no, specifically recognizable time period. Which makes 101 Dalmatians such a fascinating piece to analyse, because it's just, the world at the time that it was created through the lens of Disney. Disney films have long been synonymous with having a massive emphasis on the nuclear family, the importance and glamour of getting married and living happily ever after. And perhaps people today are a little too quick to shrug this off as being, of the time. 1950s America is remembered as a period of conformity with traditional gender roles especially. However, it was also a decade of change. This is when discontent with the status quo was really emerging. The reason we remember it as being so entrenched in family values is because the mass media at the time, and the mass media now left behind, was reinforcing messages of traditional gender roles, consumer culture, and the Cold War ideal of domesticity.
You've no idea how much I've got to do. Remember, I haven't got your dream kitchen to make things easier.
This whole kitchen was designed for efficiency and convenience.
Is the coffee all right?
Mm-mm.
You mean it's as bad as yesterday?
Mm-hmm.
No improvement at all?
Mm-mm.
Harold, don't just shake your head. You've got to tell me what's wrong with the coffee.
Bad taste.
This is the information we often look to and look back on when remembering that time period. Disney, being a popular media powerhouse, also pushed these ideals. Therefore, it's not surprising to look back at 101 and realise that family values are at the core of the film. 101 illustrates the allure of suburban family life. But the reality was, especially of women's lives at the time, it didn't always reflect these ideals. Even when gender rules and norms were socially enforced, the 1950s was not as conformist as it is sometimes remembered.
The decision to have a child should not be a matter to be decided by the male.
And discontent with the status quo often bubbled beneath the surface of this kind of placid peacetime society. So although women were expected to identify as, primarily as wives and mothers and to eschew work outside of the home, they also continued to make up a significant proportion of the post-war labour force. The 1950s also witnessed a significant change in pattern of sexual behaviour, which would ultimately lead to the sexual revolution of the 1960s. 101 Dalmatians, in contrast to society's shifting and complex ideals, is actually quite a simple story of a young married couple in early 1960s London. And like many Disney films, this too is a story about finding true love, getting married, and vanquishing evil. But more interesting than that, it's also about the importance of having and protecting children. From the beginning, Pongo dreams of married life. Bored of the mundane day-to-day bachelorhood, he longingly looks out the window in hopes of finding a partner for both him and his owner Roger. He then eventually sets up Roger and Anita at the park, which works out great because Anita also has a female Dalmatian dog, Perdita, which is a name I'm pretty sure has not survived past 1965, and I will pronounce it wrong, so please forgive me. Then in the next shot, bam, they are married. There's no messing around here. This film is just so entrenched in gender roles and tradition, even when Perdita is giving birth to the puppies. The men wait outside as if they're forbidden to enter the delivery room. There's even a wholesome scene of the dogs sitting around the TV before bed, which is very reminiscent of, the classic, idyllic 1950s image. What, therefore, could be more of a threat to this little happy family than a single, loud, ambitious woman outside of the family unit? Cruella is the antithesis of family values. She subverts all desirable female gender roles of the time. She is unmarried, she's older, she's abrasive, she's confident, she's selfish, and she's vain, with very little to no motherly qualities. Just look how Cruella is designed here. She is first revealed to us as this kind of spider-like silhouette darkening the door of their home. She is comprised mostly of kind of harsh white and black contrasting clothes, with blood red opera gloves, inner coat, and long, almost kind of clown-like shoes, especially for her fragile frame. And her face is sharp and angular. Her cheeks have this sort of skeletal, bony, protruding structure. And her face is sickly pale as well. Look at the color difference between Anita. Her face is so sick looking. And I just love how the animators emphasize the contrast between her kind of voluminous fur coats and her dangerously bony limbs. I also love the over-the-top green eyeshadow, as well as the sort of nauseous, trailing cigarette smoke to match. She's literally bringing toxicity into the family home. It's just so great to watch, and her presence on screen is just mesmerizing, isn't it? And also, just comparing Cruella and Anita again, it's always amusing to me too that Anita and Cruella are said to be classmates, while Cruella just looks so much older. However, despite this, Cruella is in part a modern woman as well. She adores high fashion, and art. She's independent, she's ambitious, she's brash, and she's loud. She represents the sort of new, empowered, independent bourgeois woman of the 1960s. She doesn't need a man. In fact, she employs them. So it's pretty amusing that Disney compares a single, older, rich woman to the devil, not just with her name, Cruella de Vil, and her spider-like appearance, but also her aptly named manor home, Hell Hall, which I actually think is so dope. Like, if I ever get wealthy and decide, fuck the purr, then yeah, I'm gonna name my mansion Hell Hall, dye my hair 2 different colors, just be like, fuck it. What's next? What's next on my evil list of evil things? The film clearly wants its audience to link being unmarried to having poor moral values or being vain or as undesirable to men. Oh my god, could you imagine such a thing? She cares only for her materialistic delights, not children or puppies or men. In fact, she openly belittles and berates the men in the story, including Roger. So she's definitely sort of a threat within the family home. Now, Emma Stone's Cruella may have started as the origin story of a Disney villain, and when I think of the film in this way, I have to admit, I kind of hate it. But I start to quickly forgive it again when I think it's actually not Cruella's origin story, it's an alternative film, a film about class warfare set in the 1970s punk movement. Okay, now hear me out. Cruella embodies a rebellion. She doesn't follow the status quo or uphold family values. And I suppose the writers really took that theme of rebellion to heart and just wrote whatever story they wanted to. But anyway, as a child, Estella and her mother, Catherine, are making clothes for dolls, and Cruella refuses to follow the pattern, stating that the instructed way is ugly.
Well, that's not the pattern. You have to follow the pattern as a way of doing things.
That's ugly.
Including my mother.
Oh, her name's Estella, not Cruella.
This scene is perfect. It sets us up for the film's conflict and embraces its punk soul. Cruella is a creative, but she's also anti-establishment, anti-structure, and she's a rule breaker. This time, instead of portraying the challenges to gender roles as scary and an imposing threat to family life, Cruella challenges Britain's obsession with social status. She joins an unconventional adoptive family of orphans, which I think is quite telling with the theme of family. She makes her own family, or finds her own. Cruella isn't a villain. She's a working class hero, an impoverished orphan, a struggling child forced to commit crimes to survive. Yet, despite her lack of wealth and education, Estella is, she's an artistic genius that the rigged system does not give merit. When Estella gets a job at London's high fashion store, which she had to, do that through less than legal means, liberties, she is subjugated and treated as lesser because of her class. It's worth noting here as well that Estella doesn't make it by, working harder within the system. She knows the world is rigged against her. She does try at first, but she realizes that it's pointless. So instead, she makes the choice to tear the system down. It's not through meritocracy and following the status quo that allows Estella to break from her subjugated role. No, it's because she rebelled and made a name for herself by, drunkenly vandalizing the front window display of her employer's shop. She's a cool girl. I really want to have a drink with Estella. Anyway, even after she redesigns the shop window, her boss can't see past her social class. Like, he can't even see her genius because it's her that did it. I will say it is unclear if Estella consciously made the decision. However, this moment in the film can be pinpointed as her first act of war against the social upper classes of London elites, proudly displaying to the world in the centre of London that no, she will not play by the rules. She is a creative and she has a skill and she will use it, regardless of if she's allowed to by her superiors. And when her mum, Catherine, was killed... Okay, before I go on, I know that this is unquestionably, hands down, one of the funniest scenes that have ever happened in cinematic history. Like, the fact that her mom was killed by Dalmatian dogs by kicking her off a cliff is bloody hilarious. I'm sorry, that is quite funny. Objectively, very funny. It's a very funny scene. I seen the clip on Twitter a week or so before I actually went to go see the film. And I was worried. I was very worried about the film just because of that clip, because it was so silly. But actually, with the framing of in context of the whole film, it was fine. But isolated, that's a funny clip. That is a very funny clip. Anyway, putting that to one side, her mum being killed in that way, I think is quite poignant. Because Catherine, her mum, was a servant to the Baroness who begged her former employer for money. And the framing here is just great. So there's a single mum begging her employer for help to support her family while they stand outside the Baroness's glittering elite party. And I love the costume design here too. So it's like a themed party. And they're all dressed like nobility. So they're all old school, wealthy aristocrats. They're just dripping with... And further emphasising the film's theme of class conflict and the social class between Estella and the Baroness is the costume designs in the film. I think they're done absolutely stunningly. But yes, so when Estella is hired by the Baroness, she soon begins to play by the rules of society, delighted that things have worked out. She even repeats to Horace and Jasper that there is no angle. And what I quite like about this section of the script is that she suddenly becomes stagnant once again in her social class and position. It's only when Estella rebels is when her position in society starts to shift and the plot starts to get interesting. So I do like that as like a mechanism or a message of the film. Her status quo, her trying to follow by the rules, isn't going to help her. She literally needs to rebel. She needs to add a bit of anarchy in order to shift these stagnant social rules and rules. She realizes that the Baroness killed her mother, Catherine, a plot twist that we all knew was coming, and it's kind of played out like we don't know. It's very strange. Estella makes the decision to seek revenge. She starts to quickly gain power and even becomes the true rival of the Baroness. Even Estella's fashion is the epitome of both class struggle and creative brilliance. I love the costume designs in this film. I think it's great. Her rubbish dress, which isn't actually rubbish, it's just made of rubbish, made of, newspapers, loose, cheap fabrics and scraps that she found, kind of reflects both her lack of financial means and resourcefulness. The Baroness at one point even refers to the class difference between herself and Estella, saying, of her stolen design, it's a ludicrously expensive dress. Cruella could never afford to make it. And she's right. Cruella instead destroys the dress and the rest of the Baroness's spring line. Cruella turns the Baroness's traditional designs, elite, segregation, and obedience to social norms into weights that actually drag her down. Though I enjoyed it, there were parts of Cruella that I found a little tedious. The gritty visual style of the film doesn't match the script at times, which I thought was a little over the top, goofy and silly for me. Some of the parts of the script were a bit convoluted, like trying to get her mother's necklace. The plan was just a bit complicated. And I get that they're trying to do like a heist thing in the middle of the film. So I don't know, maybe I just wasn't in the mood for it or it wasn't set up properly, but I just thought it was silly. Having said that, I did overall have a fun time, so I'll not complain too much. The best parts of Cruella was when Emma Stone and Emma Thompson were facing off. I thought they did an incredible job, and I'm a massive fan of Emma Thompson. They're both such strong actresses. Emma Thompson in particular, I just thought stole the show. I actually wrote down in my notes that this film should be called The Baroness because she just embodied the classic Cruella way more than the actual character of Cruella. Emma Stone brings that same kind of wit and jagged, edgy, ruthless quirkiness from her, from The Favourite, the Oscar-nominated performance. But honestly, and I'm going to go back to criticizing it a little bit here, it took so long to get to those great moments. So for the first 20-ish minutes of the film, when we followed Estella as a kid with her mum, I gotta be honest here, I was getting a little bored. Plus the soundtrack was really overdone for me personally. There were scenes that don't need a soundtrack, and because of it being there, it just felt like it added too much. Like there was just so much going on, and it just made the whole scene kind of overwhelming. Also, another thing that was kind of weird that bothered me a bit was that the film can't seem to make its mind up if Cruella Cruella was born evil or is driven mad by circumstance. It's kind of the Joker problem, but make it Disney. You know, was he mentally ill? Was it bad circumstance? Do we need more social programs? Was he always going to be like this? It's just a little messy. It's not very clear cut. This is funny because, you know, she's not even evil. She's demonstrably fine. She isn't exactly a poor girl who's a genius either. Like, they can't just make decisions. She's a poor girl, but actually she's not. She's related to a famous, you know, rich fashion designer. Sorry, that's the big twist. And that's why she's a genius. So for a film about anti-social structure, there's a weird blood-breeding classism in that, I find. Like, I get that was the twist. The Baroness is your mum, yada yada. But for me personally, I would have liked Cruella to be just a genius who couldn't be recognised because of her circumstance. And while that is still the case, the whole related to a famous fashion designer, that must be where you get your talent from. That's, you know, why you're so good at fashion. That's why she's rich. She deserves to be rich, and so do you. I felt like it was backing out of a really good decision. If the point is she's a genius who can't be seen because of her class, then everything in the script, I feel, needs to be tighter in order to support that idea. Oh, also, another thing that made me go, you know, what? Was when at the end of the film, Pongo and Perdita are born as siblings and then given to Anita and Roger. Okay, Disney, not afraid of a little incest there, I see. Okay, fair enough. However, I think the weirdest decision for me in Cruella was when Estella was born with black and white hair. What's that about? Why can't you just be a little weird and dye your hair in a weird way? Like, isn't that better? Like, she's literally a fashion designer. Like, changing her appearance to be unconventional is her whole, you know, it's her whole thing. And I always assumed that the original 101 Dalmatians Cruella had dyed hair, you know, had dyed her hair. You know, she loves black and white. She's dyed her hair like that to match her outfits, and just, she's a little weird, she's a little quirky. Thus wants a Dalmatian coat. You know, it all makes sense. The backstory of her being born that way makes the 2021 Cruella seem more like a cartoon than the original cartoon. Just weird decisions. Another criticism that I have of most live action remakes of animated classics is it seems to me that the director doesn't consider silhouette the way an animator or an animation director would consider silhouette. One of the 12 principles of animation is staging, and what staging essentially is just to make sure that the idea is clear and you know for sure where you want the audience's eye line to be looking at on the screen. And a lot of these live action shots, not only did they not silhouette their characters, which makes their poses kind of unclear, which would be horrendous for animation, all the color is kind of similar, and not in a cool monochrome way. Like, the actual tone is all very similar. There's no like contrast or dynamic range within the frame. It's very, very dark, like that horrendous scene in Game of Thrones, which to me lacks, you know, clarity for the scene. I don't know where I'm supposed to be looking, and I don't know what to look at. And also, just the characters, in my opinion, should pop in the back from the background. In the end, 2021 Cruella is not just about rebellion, but revenge. Not only personal revenge against the Baroness, but you could argue it's also about rebelling against the system that cast Cruella and her mother aside. And these are still, for me, the best parts of the film. The Baroness, on her side, has wealth and social mobility, while Cruella utilizes, you know, public image, cooperation, and performance art to gain popularity. Cruella knows she can't win in the Baroness's world, so she boldly breaks down the Baroness's world and creates her own. She makes room for her own creations to shine. And I love this aspect of the film so much, and I think it's at its strongest when Cruella is actively using the artificial kind of strengths of nobility to torpedo them into obscurity. And I really enjoyed it. Despite its shortcomings, I thought it was a really fun watch. And you know what? It was refreshing. It's just nice for Disney to kind of shake up the formula of rehashing old animated classics, into live action, or just telling the story from the misunderstood villain. I think it was uniquely different. And honestly, a breath of fresh air. You know, I like seeing Disney actually do something a little different with these characters for once. And while I actually really like this trend of defending villains by telling their heartbreaking backstory, it sometimes takes away from what makes them so fun in the first place. A good villain shows us the compelling nature of being bad. A villain reveals to us that We all have the potential to be dark and evil, which is maybe why we're so interested in how they got there in the first place, as we see ourselves in them. The villain reveals to us that we all have the potential to be dark and evil, and in a way, this makes them more human than the protagonist, and we all have temptations for greed and power. A good story will often show us what happens when we, allow ourselves to succumb to these desires. Villains can also say something about the darkness in our society. Villains are intentionally philosophical. They represent a core badness. And in my opinion, she's one of the finest villains in cinema. She's so incredibly evil. She's only really seen in a handful of shots, yet she manages to be so bloody compelling and steals the scene. Of all the Disney villains to ever grace our screens, there is none quite so devious as Cruella de Vil. Other Disney villains like Jafar, sure. Hades and Scar, they take the prize for the most ambitious. I'll give you that. But there's a particularly twisted darkness to orchestrating the murder of 101 adorable puppies just, to have something nice to wear. It's so twisted and intimate and fucked up. Really pure evil. She's like evil in a bottle. There's just something so inherently nasty about that.
And it's simple. This Cruella is evil and this one's not.
Knocking your friend's cereal off the table and being a bit bossy is not akin to skinning puppies. And Emma Stone's version simply does not progress enough to be evil. Maybe in Cruella 2 we'll start to see a little bit more of a development there. They have hinted to a second Cruella film, but honestly, Emma Stone's Cruella just has too much heart. She's so endearing. Craig Gillespie had to put another evil character into the story, the Baroness, who's more Cruella-like than Cruella. There is a literal Cruella-like villain inside the Cruella origin story. This is bananas. I can only imagine the prequel to Cruella being the Baroness, where we explore the Baroness's past and how she isn't just evil, she's a victim of circumstances as well. At the hands of another more evil Cruella-like character, and the cycle goes on forever. Anyway, while Cruella has a better message and, more thoughtful representation, its execution was a little haphazard and bizarre for my tastes, and 101 Dalmatians is just hands down the better film. I prefer the simplicity of a good versus bad story, and I gotta be honest, I like a villain, alright? I like a good villain. And I also I'm obsessed with that gritty style of animation. The production of the film also signaled a change in the graphic style of Disney's animation. Ub Iwerks, in charge of the, special processes at the studio, had been experimenting with zero photography to aid in the animation. So by about 1959, he had modified a Xerox camera to transfer drawings by the animators directly to the cells, which completely eliminated inking process and preserved the kind of spontaneity of the pencil elements, which I think adds a lot of character to the film. And I think it's really pretty, and I love the color palette, and there's so many scenes that I think are just so gorgeous and heart-wrenching. And the introduction of zoography eased graphic reproduction requirements, but at the price of being unable to deviate from, a sort of scratchy outline style. It also saved money, but I think it looks better for me personally. But yeah, I love 101 Dalmatians. I love the way the story moves along really tightly and how the jeopardy is always present. With Cruella, while a lot of fun, has a pacing issue and a sort of tonal mismatch between, the script and what's on screen that the original does not. 101 is just so much more pure in its execution, even though the message is outdated and really sexist. I just love the gritty style of the animation, the performances, the script, the wholesomeness of it all, and it's a shame that it has such dated representation, and it's a shame that, the message is, for a lack of a better word, really crap. And Cruella for sure wins that round. But I'm sorry to say, overall, 101 is just so much more entertaining to watch. And if you were to ask me right now, which film would you want to watch right now? It's gotta be 101 every time. I also just unironically love OG Cruella. I know she's a wannabe puppy murderer, but come on, look at her. Look at her slapping Horace and Jasper here. She's just so much fun, and she's entertaining to watch. I love this devil woman, you know, and I love watching this evil person get her comeuppings and fall from grace than to watch Emma Stone climb the social ladder. I don't know. It's just way more fun. Anyway, thanks for watching. The link to my bibliography is down below if you want to read some of the inspiration behind this essay, and I hope you have a cozy day.